Evan Holloway walked into Crestmont Industries carrying a worn leather case and a gray suit he had owned for 9 years. To Alexandra Whitmore, the chief executive, he looked like an unemployed man trying to sneak onto a floor that did not belong to him. When he answered one of her insults with a quiet question instead of an apology, she lifted a glass of water from the table and threw it across his chest in front of everyone. She believed she had just taught a lesser man his place. Then the door opened, and the chairman of the board looked at her and said coldly, "You misunderstood. He came here to apply for your position. If you enjoy stories where arrogance finally meets its bill, subscribe now and follow every single twist to the end. I know things about that morning that nobody in the building knew yet, and I want to begin with the cold." Chicago had turned mean overnight, and Evan Holloway came up out of the train station at 8:31 with his collar turned against the wind. He wore no watch worth stealing, no car idled at the curb for him, and the badge security handed him had his name misspelled, which he did not correct. Rachel Monroe was supposed to meet him upstairs, because Gideon Hawthorne had told her 3 days earlier that a candidate of unusual importance would arrive at 9 o'clock. But at 8:42 she had been pulled into an emergency budget session 2 floors up, so Evan sat alone in the visitor area with his leather case across his knees, waiting the way patient men wait without checking the time. At 8:51 the elevator opened and Alexandra Whitmore stepped out with 2 of her division heads trailing behind her like weather. I want to be fair to her, because she was not stupid and she was not lazy. She had run Crestmont for 6 years, she worked longer hours than any person she employed, and she had a genuine gift for reading a room and deciding within 4 seconds who in it mattered. That gift was also the flaw that would end her, because she had trained it on the wrong signal. She looked at Evan's shoes first, then the cuffs of his jacket, then the leather case, and she performed the arithmetic she always performed. The sum came out low. She did not ask him who he was. She had already decided he was a candidate for the operations manager opening on the 14th floor, and that some overworked recruiter had made a mistake with the elevator instructions. Standing 4 feet from him, close enough that he could hear every syllable, she turned to the desk attendant and said that she wanted to understand when human resources had begun delivering applicants directly to the executive level. The attendant went red and said something about a scheduled meeting. Alexandra said that scheduled meetings happened downstairs. Evan heard all of it and kept his hands folded on the case. And that stillness of his was the first thing that truly annoyed her, because frightened people are easy and calm ones are not. So she turned and addressed him directly and asked which position he was applying for. He stood up when she spoke to him, which she noticed and misfilled as deference, and he said that he had a 9 o'clock appointment with the board. The word landed in the corridor and sat there. Alexandra laughed once, short and bright, and repeated the word back to him as a question, and one of the division heads laughed too, because that is what division heads do. She told him that this floor was not a place where people came to try their luck with a resume and a hopeful expression, and that ambition without an invitation was simply trespassing with better posture. Evan said, "I understand," and did not move. She should have walked away then. Instead, she looked down at the case in his hands, at the folder resting on top of it, and she saw the cover page, and for a quarter of a second her certainty wobbled. 3 words were printed there in small capital letters, and they were not the name of any department she supervised. They read, CEO Succession Review. She leaned an inch closer to read the line beneath it, and Evan calmly closed the folder and set his hand flat on top of it, and the moment passed, and Alexandra decided she had misread it. But she did not walk away, because she could not now, and she asked him to follow her into the executive lounge so they could speak privately. He went. I have thought about that decision often, because he did not have to go, And later, he told the chairman that he wanted to see the company from the inside of its own weather before he was handed a forecast written by a board. The lounge had 2 low chairs, a table of pale stone, a pitcher of water with lemon in it, and a window that looked out at the lake going the color of pewter. She sat first. He waited to be offered a seat, and she did not offer one, so he stood until she gestured impatiently at the other chair. She asked what exactly the board had brought him in to do, and Evan told her, politely, that he was not able to discuss it. That was true, and it was also the worst possible answer, because the truth was far simpler than she could imagine. Gideon Hawthorne had been explicit in a call the previous week. The succession review was confidential. Every candidate had signed an agreement, and under no circumstance was Evan to discuss his purpose with any sitting officer of the company before the board convened. So he sat there with the one sentence that would have ended the whole humiliation locked behind his teeth, and he watched a woman make herself smaller in a room where she believed she was growing. She reached across the table and picked up his folder before he could stop her, and she pulled out the resume clipped inside the front cover, and she read it the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, hunting the fracture. She found it in 11 seconds. There it was, a gap of 22 months between his last executive role and the present day, a blank space where a career should have been, and I watched her whole posture change as she found it. 22 months, she said aloud, as though tasting something spoiled. She asked him whether a man who disappeared from executive life for nearly 2 years genuinely believed he could simply walk back in and be taken seriously. Evan said that sometimes life presents responsibilities that outrank a title. She kept reading. 2 pages down, she found the answer, or part of it, in a line about a family relocation and a change of primary custody, and she looked up and asked whether he was raising a child alone. He said that he was, that his daughter was 17 now, and that she had recently learned to drive, which he mentioned with the flicker of a smile that had nothing to do with the interview. Alexandra did not smile back. She said that she employed a great many single parents and admired them all enormously, and then she said that the position she held required 70 hours a week and travel on 4 hours' notice, and that any person who arranged his life around a family calendar had simply chosen a different league. She said it kindly, which made it worse. Evan did not argue with her. He asked one question instead, and he asked it without heat, in the tone a man uses when he is genuinely curious about a machine. If a company requires its chief executive to work 70 hours a week merely to keep the thing from collapsing, he said, is the real problem the calendar, or is it the way the company has been built to depend on one person's attention? The lounge got very quiet. Alexandra's fingers stopped moving on the paper. She had been asked variations of that question by 3 consultants, 1 former board member, and her own departing head of engineering, and she had dismissed all of them. She recovered by attacking his record, and she did it well because she was skilled at this. The last company he had operated was 1/10 of Crestmont by revenue. He held no degree from a school she considered relevant, and he came from no family with any presence in the rooms where decisions of consequence were made. She said all of it while pouring herself a glass of water from the pitcher, which I mention because the pitcher matters later. Evan waited until she finished, and then he said quietly, I did run a business that was profitable. There was no emphasis in it, nothing that could be quoted as an insult. But Crestmont had just closed its 2nd consecutive quarter of declining margin, and the internal numbers were 3 days from the board's desk. She closed the resume hard enough that the clip snapped loose, and asked him whether he imagined that he understood her company. Evan almost looked sorry for her, and he said, perhaps that's why the board asked me to come. What happened over the next 11 minutes was not a misunderstanding anymore, and both of them knew it. Alexandra shifted from establishing his rank to erasing it, and she began asking questions that had no purpose except to make him state his own smallness out loud. She asked what his final salary had been in his last role. She asked what his house was worth and whether he still carried a mortgage on it. She asked, with an expression of great gentleness, whether he had come in this morning because he simply needed steady work, because there was no shame in that, and because she could probably find something for a man with his background if he was willing to be realistic about the level. She pressed a button on the table console and called Rachel Monroe, who arrived 4 minutes later, still holding the budget folder from the meeting she had been dragged into. Alexandra instructed her to escort the gentleman down to the recruiting suite on the 14th floor and to find out which coordinator had sent him up. Rachel stopped in the doorway. She looked at Evan and then at her employer, and she said carefully that she believed Mr. Holloway was scheduled to meet with the board at 9, and that Mr. Hawthorne had asked her personally to bring him in. Alexandra cut across her before she reached the end of the sentence and said, "He does not belong on this floor." Evan stayed seated. He said, without any triumph in it, that Gideon Hawthorne had asked him to wait in this exact place, and it was the first moment all morning where Alexandra genuinely hesitated. Instead of considering that she might be wrong, she decided this man was using the chairman's name as leverage, and the theory fit so comfortably that she stopped examining it. Her voice dropped and got very even, and she told him that a person should know when to leave a room he was never invited into. Then Evan asked the question that ended the conversation and began everything else. He asked whether that was also what she had said to the 3 vice presidents who had resigned from her company that year. The pitcher stopped sweating. Nobody outside the executive floor and 1 board committee knew that number because 2 of the departures had been announced as planned transitions and the 3rd had been folded into a reorganization memo. She asked where he had gotten it, and he said that he was not able to answer, which was again the truth, because the number sat on page 9 of a confidential packet the board had sent to every candidate. Something came apart in her then, and it came apart quietly. She stood up and crossed the small distance between the chairs and looked down at him, and she told him to apologize. Evan said no. He said it the way you decline a second cup of coffee. He said, "I haven't insulted you. I asked you a question." Alexandra reached back to the stone table and picked up the glass she had poured for herself. Rachel thought she was going to drink, and honestly so did I. Instead, she turned her wrist and threw the water in a flat arc into the center of Evan Holloway's chest. It hit his tie, ran down the front of his shirt, soaked the knee of his suit, and spread across the closed folder on his lap in a dark bloom. Nobody made a sound. A division head stood frozen in the lounge entrance, holding a tablet, understanding that he would have to remember this for the rest of his life. Alexandra set the empty glass down on the stone with a small, precise click. She said, "Now you can calm down and go to the 14th floor." She actually believed the arithmetic still worked, which is the part I find hardest to explain to anyone. Evan took his glasses off, drew a folded handkerchief from his inside pocket, and dried the lenses. He did not raise his voice or stand up fast or say any of the 12 sentences a man is entitled to say in that situation. He put the glasses back on and looked at her and said, "Thank you. I think the board should know exactly how you respond when you're questioned." The lounge door swung fully open behind him. Gideon Hawthorne was 67 years old, had served on 4 boards, and had a habit of arriving exactly 2 minutes early to everything, which meant he had been standing in the corridor since 8:58. He had heard the last sentence, and the click of the glass, and the silence before both. He came in slowly and looked at the water running off the folder onto the carpet, and then at the empty glass on the table, and then at Alexandra Whitmore's hand, which was still slightly damp. She began explaining immediately, which was itself an answer. She said that an unsuitable candidate had come up to the executive level without clearance, had refused 3 requests to relocate, had made insinuations about confidential personnel matters, and had been disruptive in front of staff. Gideon let her finish completely, and the length of the silence he left afterward was the most eloquent thing in the building. Then he said, "Alexandra, you've misunderstood." He turned slightly so he was addressing the room instead of only her. "He did not come here to ask you for a job beneath you." He looked at Evan, at the ruined shirt and the wet folder, and something crossed his face that was not quite anger. "Mr. Holloway is the final candidate the board invited," he said. Alexandra's color drained so fast that Rachel took a step toward her. And then Gideon Hawthorne said the sentence that would travel through 18,000 employees in under a week, though not one of them would ever hear it from him. "He's here for your job." Now, if this were a smaller story, that would be the end of it, and Alexandra would collapse and be led away, and everyone would feel a warm little jolt of justice. That is not what happened, and I want to be precise about it, because the interesting part of the morning had not started yet. Alexandra Whitmore had been raised in a family that treated composure as a form of property, and she did not collapse. She laughed, thinly, and said she understood exactly what this was, a piece of theater the board had arranged to apply pressure on her, a warning shot dressed up as a candidate, and she said she would have preferred a direct conversation to a stunt. She said she did not appreciate being managed. Gideon did not enjoy the next part, and I could tell. He told her plainly that the board had opened a formal succession review 6 weeks earlier, that a subcommittee of 4 had run it, that 3 candidates had already completed full-day assessments, and that Evan was the 4th and last. He said the process had been documented, the outside firm had been paid, and the reference work was finished. Alexandra asked how a review of her own performance could possibly have been conducted for 6 weeks without her knowledge, and her voice went up for the first time all morning. Gideon said, without any cruelty in it, that a chief executive cannot be permitted to supervise the evaluation of that same chief executive. It was, I think, the single most painful sentence she heard that day, and it had nothing to do with the water. So she changed her weapon, which is what capable people do when they are cornered. She stopped arguing about process and started arguing about the candidate. She said that the board was being sentimental. She laid it out. A man with a 22-month hole in his history, a company 1/10 of Crestmont's size, no experience anywhere near 18,000 employees across 9 countries, and a household he was running alone. She said that if this was the caliber of the alternative, the review had already answered its own question. Then she demanded to sit in on the interview. Gideon began to refuse. He had good reasons, all of them procedural, and he got about 4 words into the first one before Evan Holloway interrupted him for the only time that day. Evan said that he had no objection. He said, "If I can't defend my thinking in front of the current chief executive, I shouldn't be sitting in her chair." Alexandra heard that as arrogance and as opportunity, and she felt the ground come back under her feet because she had spent 6 years dismantling people in that conference room and she had never lost. She smoothed her jacket. She actually smiled. Alexandra walked into the main boardroom first, and she looked magnificent. Charcoal suit cut in Milan, the whole grammar of authority spoken fluently. Evan came in behind her in a shirt stained from his collarbone to his belt, carrying a case with a watermark spreading across the flap, and 4 directors watched them both sit down. Claire Benton asked the first question, and she asked it of Evan, and she did not soften it. If the board handed him the company tomorrow morning, she said, what was the first thing he would do? Alexandra leaned back, waiting for revenue, or margin, or some rehearsed line about accelerating growth in the industrial segment, because that is what the last 3 candidates had said, and she had read their summaries. Evan set his wet case on the floor beside his chair. He said, "I wouldn't do anything on the first day." Nathaniel Crane, the chief financial officer, actually put his pen down. Alexandra smiled with real contempt, the first honest expression she had shown all morning, and she looked around the table to collect agreement, and the collection did not go well. Evan let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he finished the thought. He said, "I'd spend the first day finding out why the best people in this company are leaving." The smile went off Alexandra Whitmore's face and did not come back for a very long time. What followed was not an interview. Evan laid out 3 statements and he numbered them, and he spoke slowly enough that Claire Benton could write all 3 down. First, Crestmont did not have a revenue problem, it had a margin problem, and the two were being confused in every deck the board received. Second, Crestmont was not short of talented people, it was losing them, which is a completely different disease with a completely different treatment. Third, no department in the building lacked data, but the leadership layer had stopped wanting to hear the unflattering half of it, and once that happens, the reporting system quietly reorganizes itself around comfort. Alexandra fought him on everyone, and she fought well. She said revenue had grown 11% year over year, and that anyone calling that a problem did not understand the industry. Evan agreed with the 11%, and then noted that operating cost had grown 18% over the same period, which meant the company had purchased its growth at a loss, and called the receipt a victory. She said attrition sat within industry benchmarks. He said the aggregate figure was fine and was also hiding the answer, and he asked her to separate out the senior management band. In that band, departures were running at 3 times the rate of 2 years earlier. Claire Benton asked where the perspective came from, and Evan gave the shortest version of a career anyone in that room had ever heard. He had taken over operations at a logistics technology firm that was booking healthy revenue while bleeding both engineers and accounts. And instead of the expected layoffs, he had rebuilt the management evaluation system so that keeping good people became a measured outcome, pushed approval authority down to the department heads who knew the work, and sat with the 11 largest customers until he understood what they were tired of. 18 months later, cost was down and the company was profitable for the first time in 3 years. Alexandra went straight back to the wound she had found in the lounge because it had worked once. "And then you left," she said. Evan did not flinch and did not explain. He said, "I stepped away from a chair. I didn't step away from responsibility." He never once mentioned the illness or the funeral or the fact that a 15-year-old girl had needed one parent in one city for a while. Alexandra said that this was business and not an inspirational anecdote, and Claire Benton's pen stopped moving in a way that Alexandra did not notice. Gideon Hawthorne had been quiet for 11 minutes. He turned to Alexandra and asked her, in the same voice he used to ask about quarterly filings, why the company had lost 4 senior executives that year. Alexandra corrected him automatically, the way you correct a typo. 3, she said, and then Nathaniel Crane, who had said nothing at all since the room filled, who had reported to Alexandra Whitmore for 6 years and had twice rewritten a variance report at her request, cleared his throat and said, 4. She turned to him and asked him to repeat it. He did. He said the letter had arrived in the board's secure inbox at 7:20 that morning, that he had received a courtesy copy 19 minutes later, and that the resignation was effective in 30 days. Alexandra asked who. Nathaniel looked at the table and then looked at her, and I think that was the hardest thing he did in his entire professional life. It was Marcus Delaney, her chief operating officer, the man she had promoted herself, the one she described to investors as her right arm. The letter was 4 pages long, and it was devastating precisely because it was boring. Marcus Delaney accused nobody of a crime, and that absence of scandal made the document impossible to dismiss. What it described instead was a pattern laid out with dates. Unfavorable reports were routinely held for 1 or 2 weeks before reaching the executive committee, and twice they were held until after a board meeting. Managers who challenged a forecast were removed from the following month's meeting invitation list, and he named 4 instances. Internal delivery targets had been revised downward in March, and the revised numbers had been presented as achievements against the original plan. Alexandra read the pages standing up and said the letter was the work of a disgruntled employee who had been passed over in the spring. Claire Benton asked whether the March target revision had actually happened, and Nathaniel Crane, who had answered that same question differently 8 months earlier, said yes. Here is where Evan Holloway did the thing that decided the entire day, and it was not an attack. He had a clean shot, and he did not take it. He asked the board a single question instead, and he asked it gently, looking at the table rather than at Alexandra. He said, "How many people have to become disgruntled employees before leadership accepts that there's a problem?" Claire Benton wrote that one down too. I watched Alexandra Whitmore hear a sentence about herself that she had no argument for, and I watched her reach for the only weapon she had left. She went after his life. She said that the chief executive of Crestmont Industries spent between 80 and 100 nights a year on airplanes, that plant visits happened on 12 hours' notice, and that the Frankfurt and Sao Paulo operations required a physical presence 4 times a year each. Then she asked the board, not him, whether they seriously intended to run a company of 18,000 people according to the schedule of a man raising a teenage daughter by himself. Claire Benton opened her mouth to stop her because Claire had raised 2 children through a chief executive role and knew exactly what she was listening to. Evan answered before Claire could. He said that leadership is not measured by how many hours a person spends inside a building. He said, it is measured by whether the organization functions when that person is not there. Then he turned to Alexandra directly for the first time since the lounge, and he said, a chief executive's job is to make the company stronger than her own presence in it. It went in under her guard because it was true, and everyone at that table knew the specific truth of it. 11 categories of decision at Crestmont required Alexandra Whitmore's personal signature, procurement above a threshold so low it was almost comic. And when she took 4 days off in February, 2 plants slowed and 1 customer shipment slipped. Gideon Hawthorne let the quiet run and then said that there was one more thing, and he slid a folder down the polished table. The final exercise, he said, was a case study, and every candidate in the review had been given the same one. He read it aloud for the room. A manufacturer representing the largest single account in the company's portfolio was actively evaluating a competitor and was preparing to move 40% of its annual order volume. The candidate had to present an approach to retain the account without cutting price. Alexandra said she wanted to answer it herself alongside him, and she said it as a challenge. Gideon considered her for a long moment and then agreed, and he gave them 30 minutes. Alexandra stood immediately and told her assistant to bring her laptop, the pricing model, and 2 people from the commercial analytics group. Evan asked for one thing. He said, a pen and the customer's complaint log. Rachel Monroe brought both, and the log was 240 pages, and I watched him start reading at the back. Alexandra built her answer out of authority, and it was, by any conventional measure, a strong answer. She proposed an 8% price reduction phased over 18 months in exchange for a 3-year volume commitment, an expedited freight guarantee, replacement of the account director with a senior name the customer would recognize, and a quarterly executive review hosted at the customer's headquarters. Her analysts built 14 beautiful slides in 26 minutes, and when she finished presenting, Nathaniel Crane nodded, because on paper it worked. Evan Holloway had 4 pages of handwritten notes and no slides at all, and when Alexandra saw them, she smiled and sat back and believed the contest was over. He started with a question rather than a plan. He asked why the customer wanted to leave. Alexandra said price, obviously, since the competitor had come in 11% below on the last two bids, and she said it as though explaining gravity. Evan opened the complaint log and turned it so the table could see the tabs he had folded. Over 14 months, he said, the customer's procurement team had raised price exactly one time, in a single line item of a single letter in November. Reliability of delivery appeared 17 times. 17, across 4 different signatories, escalating in tone from request to warning to a 2-sentence note in June that used the word pattern. Then he did the arithmetic out loud, and it was brutal in the way that plain numbers are brutal. An 8% reduction across that account's volume was roughly $31 million of annual revenue surrendered, most of it straight out of margin, and it addressed a complaint the customer had made once in over a year. Worse, he said, the discount would confirm to the customer's own operations people that Crestmont still did not understand what was wrong, because you do not solve a broken promise by making it cheaper. He said the competitor was not winning on price. The competitor was winning because it delivered when it said it would. His plan had 5 parts and no slides, no price movement at all in the first 60 days. A recovery team pulled from operations, planning, and the account side, reporting directly to one executive sponsor with a single name attached, because accountability held by a committee is accountability held by nobody. 2 specific constraints fixed in the Toledo plant, which he named from the log, a scheduling handoff and a component staging delay that together accounted for most of the late shipments in the escalation letters. Weekly delivery performance published directly to the customer's own dashboard, unfiltered including the bad weeks. And only then, in the second phase, a performance-based penalty clause in which Crestmont would pay if it missed the new commitment, which converted a discount into a promise with teeth. Nathaniel Crane ran the numbers on his tablet while Evan was still speaking and said, out loud, that the penalty exposure at realistic performance sat under $4 million a year against $31 million of preserved revenue. Claire Benton asked Evan how long it had taken him to find the delivery pattern in the log. Evan said, 11 minutes. Alexandra said it was luck. She said that the case study happened to be a logistics problem handed to a man with a logistics background, and that this was less an assessment than a rigged coin. And Gideon Hawthorne, who had been waiting for exactly that objection, told the room the part that had not been disclosed. The case study had not been written for Evan Holloway. It had not been written at all. It was the Kirkland manufacturing account, verbatim from the actual file, and the actual decision was live as of that week. Alexandra Whitmore sat down, and what was on her face was not embarrassment, but the specific vertigo of a person discovering that the ground she had been defending was not where she thought it was. She had hosted those executives in April. She had approved the discount analysis 3 weeks earlier, and she had told her own board in writing that the risk was competitive pricing pressure. Then Nathaniel Crane's tablet buzzed, and he read the message twice before he spoke. Kirkland's chief procurement officer was requesting an urgent call today and had offered a window at 2 o'clock. The room looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Evan, and I could see the offer forming in his face, the chance to hand this man the microphone and let him finish what he had started in front of the entire board. Evan declined it. He said that Alexandra should take the call. She thought for a moment that he was conceding, and something like relief moved across her, and then Evan said, "This is still her company today." He meant it exactly as it sounded. He said the recovery approach would need the current chief executive to own it, whether or not she remained in the chair, because the customer needed to hear it from the person whose name was on the contract, and because a plan introduced by a candidate is a plan that dies on Monday. He did not want to win by breaking her. They took the call at 2 o'clock in the same room on speaker with the board present. Kirkland sent 3 people, the chief procurement officer, her director of supply assurance, and a lawyer who said nothing for 40 minutes. The procurement officer was courteous and completely direct. She said that Kirkland had received the pricing overture from Crestmont's commercial team in July and had discussed it internally, and that pricing was not the issue and had never been the issue. She said her plants had been given delivery commitments 11 times since the spring, and that 6 of them had been missed, 3 by more than a week, and that her own production schedule had absorbed the cost of that twice and could not absorb it a third time. Alexandra had a real opening in that call, and I want to be clear that it was genuine. If she had accepted responsibility and put her own name on the 60-day commitment, 2 of the 4 directors were prepared to argue for keeping her through a transition, and Claire Benton later told me she had already decided to make that argument. Instead, she said the delivery failures were an operations issue, and that operations had not escalated properly. Then she said that the officer responsible for that function had resigned that very morning, which she framed as an explanation and which landed as an abandonment. When the procurement officer pressed on the June letter, Alexandra said that Kirkland was reacting strongly to a difficult few weeks in a long and profitable relationship. She used the phrase overreacting once. The temperature of the call dropped so fast that Rachel Monroe stopped typing. The procurement officer let 2 full seconds go by. Then she said, "That is precisely why we want to leave." Nobody at the Crestmont end of the table breathed. Gideon Hawthorne turned his head and asked Evan Holloway whether he had anything to add, and it was the first time all day that Evan spoke without being spoken to first, and even then he waited for the invitation. He asked 3 questions and nothing else. What delivery performance did Kirkland need Crestmont to hit? Over what measurement period would it need to be sustained before Kirkland considered the relationship repaired? And what level of visibility into that performance would Kirkland require in order to give Crestmont one more opportunity rather than issuing the transfer notice? The procurement officer answered all 3 with numbers, and her voice changed while she did it, because those were the questions she had been trying to get someone at Crestmont to ask for 14 months. 96% on time against confirmed dates, sustained across 60 days, reported weekly by direct feed with no summaries. What Kirkland agreed to, in the end, was not a rescue. They would hold the transfer decision for 60 days and place one of their own supply people in the weekly review, and that was all. It was permission to try, and permission to try was worth $31 million a year and had been 40 minutes from being lost forever. When the line went dead, Alexandra Whitmore turned to the board and attacked. She said that Evan Holloway had arrived in the building that morning with the specific intention of humiliating her, that he had withheld his purpose deliberately in order to provoke her into a reaction, and that the entire sequence, including the incident in the lounge, had been engineered to produce exactly this scene. She said the word ambush. She said that she had been set up on her own executive floor by a man with nothing to lose. Rachel Monroe had been in the room for 6 hours and had not spoken once. She was 35 years old. She had worked for the board for 4 years and she had a mortgage. She said into the silence, "Mr. Holloway said almost nothing before you began insulting him." Then she said that she had been standing in the lounge doorway and that he had not raised his voice, and that he had asked to be moved wherever the building preferred. Nobody had asked her for any of it. Alexandra turned on her, and I have thought about how fast it happened. She said, "You might want to remember who signs your paychecks." It was the last sentence she spoke as chief executive of Crestmont Industries, and she chose it herself, and no board member had to write it down because all 4 of them would remember it identically. Gideon Hawthorne did not raise his voice either. He said, "No, the company signs hers." Then he asked Alexandra to step out of the room. She did not move at first, and he did not repeat it, and eventually she gathered her folder and her laptop and walked to the door, and Rachel opened it for her. Because Rachel was the kind of person who opens doors for people who have just insulted her. And Alexandra Whitmore stood on the wrong side of a boardroom door on the executive floor of the company she had run for 6 years, in a building where every conference room was hers, and understood that she was not permitted to go back in. The board questioned Evan for 2 more hours without her, and Claire Benton was harder on him than Alexandra had been, because Claire did not care about his shirt. She said she was not inclined to hand a company of 18,000 people to a man who could read a complaint log. Then she asked, "Do you want Alexandra fired over the glass of water?" Evan said, "No." Nathaniel Crane looked up sharply. Evan explained it slowly, because he was working it out as he said it, and I believe that was the truest thing he said all day. He said that no chief executive should lose a career over one stupid moment in one corridor, that everyone in that room had a moment they were grateful nobody had recorded, and that a company which fires people for their worst 4 seconds will end up led entirely by people who are very good at not being caught. Claire asked him what a chief executive should be judged on instead. He had 4 answers ready. How they manage people, he said, measured not by engagement surveys, but by whether talented people stay. How they respond to unfavorable data, measured by whether bad news travels upward at the same speed as good news. How they handle a customer who is telling them the truth. And, last, how they treat a person they believe has no power over them. He said the 4th one was the only one that could not be coached, prepared for, or faked in an interview. Then he said the sentence that Claire Benton would later repeat at 2 other board tables and 1 commencement address. How a person treats someone they need doesn't tell you much about them, Evan said. How they treat someone they think they don't need tells you everything. Gideon Hawthorne, who had been chairman for 9 years and had hired 4 chief executives, wrote nothing down because he did not need to. Then he asked Evan whether he would accept the position if the board offered it to him. And Evan Holloway, who had been thrown out of a lounge, called an opportunist, mocked for raising his daughter, and drenched in front of witnesses, did not say yes. He said he had 3 conditions. First, a reporting structure the chief executive could not throttle. Unfavorable operational data delivered to the audit committee on a fixed schedule, unedited, whether he wanted it seen or not, including data about him. Second, a full reassessment of the management layer built around retention and development rather than output alone, because the company had spent 2 years promoting people who hit numbers by burning the people who produced them. Third, the authority to build his own executive team rather than inherit a structure that had been selected for its willingness to agree. Gideon told him plainly that he was not the only candidate, that one of the other 3 had run a division of comparable scale and had been rated highly by the outside firm, and that the board would vote before the end of the week. But he said one other thing, and he said it standing up, which for Gideon Hawthorne was practically a fanfare. He said, "You did not walk in here this morning as an insider. You are not walking out as an outsider." Then he asked Rachel Monroe to bring Alexandra Whitmore back into the room. They did not fire her that afternoon, because that is not how it works, and the truth is less theatrical and much heavier. Gideon read the grounds of a documented 6-week review without emphasis. 2 consecutive quarters of margin decline against 11% revenue growth, operating cost up 18%, senior attrition at 3 times the baseline, an internal confidence measure down 31 points, and the near loss of the largest account in the portfolio to a cause the chief executive had misidentified in writing. He said the morning's conduct had not created any of that. He said it had merely confirmed it. The subcommittee moved to end her tenure and to trigger the transition provisions of her agreement, and the vote was 4-0 with Nathaniel Crane abstaining because he was an officer and not a director, though his hand had been in the air for a moment before he remembered. Alexandra listened to all of it without moving, Then she looked at Evan Holloway across the table and said the only thing she had left. She said the whole thing had been arranged in advance, that the board had chosen him weeks ago, and that the morning had been a performance staged for a decision already made. Gideon said, no. He said that when Evan Holloway walked into the lobby at 8:31 that morning, the board had not decided anything, that 2 members had favored a different candidate as recently as Tuesday, and that the file on the table had contained 4 names and no recommendation. And then he looked at the dark stain still drying across the front of Evan's shirt, and at the watermark on the leather case by his chair, and he said the thing I have never forgotten. He said, in fact, you interviewed him before we did. Alexandra did not understand, and she said so. So Gideon explained it, and he was not cruel about it, which somehow made it worse. He said that no assessment the board could design would ever have told them what she had told them for free in a lounge on a Tuesday morning. She had shown them how the man behaved when he was insulted by someone with power over him and no reason to fear him. He had not raised his voice. He had not invoked the chairman's name as a threat when it would have ended the whole thing in one sentence. He had not retaliated against an assistant who was following orders, had not walked out, had not once mentioned that he was the final candidate for the chair of the woman standing over him. And then, Gideon said, when the balance of power in the building reversed completely and the microphone was offered to him, he had handed it back and put the company's largest account in the hands of the person who had just humiliated him, because that account mattered more than the pleasure of a moment. The board had spent $40,000 on an outside assessment firm, and Alexandra Whitmore had produced a better test in 11 minutes, and had not charged them for it. She had built, by hand, the most favorable examination her own rival would ever sit. Her face when she understood that is the part I would want anyone who thinks about power to see. A few weeks later, after the committee finished and the announcement ran 3 paragraphs long, Evan Holloway became chief executive of Crestmont Industries. He did not arrive as a savior, and he did not pretend to be one, and the second quarter under him was mediocre. On his first day, he did not move into the corner office, because Alexandra's belongings were still being packed, and he saw no reason to hurry a woman's boxes. He spent the entire morning in a windowless room on the 22nd floor with 11 department heads who had not been asked their opinion in 2 years. And he asked each of them the same 2 questions. What do you know that nobody upstairs wants to hear? And what would you fix this week if I gave you the authority? The old leather case sat next to his desk, unreplaced. Rachel Monroe, who was now his chief of staff, came in that afternoon with a catalog and asked whether he wanted the executive furniture changed, since every incoming chief executive used that budget line. Evan looked around the enormous quiet room for a while and said, "Change the door first." He wanted the solid wood panel taken out and replaced with glass, so that anyone walking past could see whether he was alone, and so that no conversation held in that room could ever again be a conversation nobody knew had happened. At 6 that evening, Evan took a short call and said he would be home by 7:30, and that, yes, he would pick up the thing on the counter list, and that no, she could not have the car for the whole weekend. Then he stood and put on his coat. The leather case still carried a faint, pale ring across the flap where the water had dried into the grain, and Rachel had once offered to have it treated, and he had said no. He did not keep it to remember Alexandra Whitmore, because he thought about her almost never after that autumn. He kept it because of the principle it had cost him a shirt to prove. Power does not reveal who a person is through the way they treat those above them, since everyone performs well while being watched by someone who can end them. It reveals them in the 4 seconds when they are certain that the person standing in front of them can do absolutely nothing about it. Alexandra Whitmore had been given that test at 8:51 on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a lounge with a pitcher of water and lemon in it, with no board watching and nothing at stake. She failed it before anyone told her she was taking it, and by 9 o'clock, the answer had already been recorded, in water, on the front of a 9-year-old gray suit.